The room went silent when the bride's father raised his glass and looked directly at me. "To the families," he said, smiling. Everyone lifted their glasses. Then his smile changed. "And to the people who know their place." A few guests laughed nervously. He kept his eyes on me. "Some people spend their whole lives climbing," he continued. "Others are simply grateful to be allowed inside the building." Someone at the table coughed. My son looked down. I already knew where this was going. The bride's father leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass. "And some," he said loud enough for all 184 guests to hear, "will always be the bottom rung." That was the moment he humiliated me in front of everyone at my own son's rehearsal dinner. I could have stood up. I could have shouted. I could have told the room exactly who I was and what I had done for my son. Instead, I reached beneath the table and felt the smooth wooden box I had carried with me. Inside was something I had planned to give my son the next morning. I closed my hand around the box. Then I stood. Nobody expected what happened next. I simply picked up the box, nodded once to my son, and walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't insult anyone. I didn't defend myself. I made one quiet phone call. And that phone call changed the wedding, the family, and the future of everyone sitting at that table. The strange thing was, the bride's father had no idea who he was insulting. He thought I was just an old contractor who had been lucky enough to raise a successful son. He didn't know that for 32 years, I had quietly built something far more valuable than a fancy house or a country club membership. And he definitely didn't know that his family business was standing on something I owned. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for most of my life, I was perfectly comfortable being underestimated. My wife died when our son, Ethan, was 19. After the funeral, there were months when Ethan barely spoke. He would sit at the kitchen table with his textbooks open, staring at the same page for an hour. I wanted to tell him everything would be okay. But I knew better. Sometimes life doesn't become okay because someone says it will. So I kept working. I repaired roofs, restored old houses, built decks, fixed foundations, and eventually started taking larger commercial projects. I wasn't a businessman in a suit. I wore work boots. My hands were permanently rough. There was always a faint smell of sawdust and machine oil on my jackets. But I taught Ethan something my father had taught me. If you make a promise, keep it. If you give someone your word, it matters. And if you ever become successful, don't use success to make someone else feel small. Ethan remembered that. He built his own career in finance and eventually became a partner at a growing investment firm. I was proud of him, but I never tried to take credit. When he met Claire, I liked her immediately. She was intelligent, calm, and seemed genuinely interested in Ethan rather than his career. For the first year, everything was good. Then I met her family. Her father, Richard Langley, owned a regional construction and development company called Langley Development Group. He was wealthy, polished, and accustomed to people listening when he spoke. At our first dinner, he asked me what I did. "Commercial construction and restoration," I told him. He smiled. "So you're a tradesman? I suppose that's one way to put it." He laughed. "Not cruelly, at least not yet. I mean it as a compliment," he said. "People like you are the backbone of the country." I thanked him. But something about the way he said, "people like you," stayed with me. Over the next 2 years, Richard became increasingly dismissive. He made jokes about my truck. He asked Ethan why he didn't buy me a newer car. He once looked around my modest house and said, "You could have done better if you had invested instead of working with your hands." Ethan always defended me. "Dad built this house himself." Richard shrugged. "I know. I'm sure it was a very satisfying hobby." I swallowed the anger. I did it for Ethan. Because Ethan loved Claire. And Claire loved Ethan. At least, I believed she did. The wedding was supposed to be the happiest weekend of my son's life. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Langley Country Club. The place was enormous. Crystal chandeliers. White tablecloths. Waiters moving silently between tables. There were 184 guests. I remember the number because Ethan mentioned it 3 times that week. Dad, I just want everyone to get along. I smiled. They will. He looked at me carefully. You promise? I promise. I didn't know then how hard that promise would become to keep. Richard gave a speech after dinner. At first, it was warm. He talked about Claire as a little girl. He talked about Ethan's career. Then he started talking about families. He praised the Langleys for 3 generations of success. Then he mentioned maintaining standards. That was when he looked at me. His words became sharper. He said marriage wasn't just about 2 people. It was about joining families with similar values, expectations, and social standing. I felt Ethan shift beside me. Then Richard raised his glass. To the bottom rung, he said. People laughed because they didn't know what else to do. I looked at Ethan. His face had gone pale. Claire whispered something to her father. Richard ignored her. I could have destroyed him right there. Because I knew something he didn't. 3 years earlier, Richard's company had needed a major loan to rescue a failing development project. The bank had demanded additional collateral. Richard had offered properties. The problem was that one of the most valuable properties wasn't entirely his. A small parcel of land near the city had been purchased decades earlier by my father. After his death, I inherited it. Richard's company had approached me privately about buying it. I refused. Then they came back with a partnership proposal. I eventually agreed to lease the property under a long-term commercial agreement. The project became one of Langley Development Group's most profitable investments. Richard never knew I was behind the private holding company that owned the land. He assumed the property belonged to an anonymous investor. I had never told Ethan either. I didn't want my son's marriage to be tangled in business. But there was another reason. 2 months before the wedding, I had discovered something disturbing. The holding company had received several unusual requests from Richard's financial team. They wanted to renegotiate the lease. They wanted a large extension. And one document had been signed using my name. I hadn't signed it. Someone had forged my signature. I had quietly hired an accountant to review the records. What he found was worse than I expected. Money had been moved through several related companies. Not enough to immediately look criminal. Enough to hide a serious cash flow problem. Richard's company was in trouble. And Ethan's investment firm was being positioned to provide financing. The marriage wasn't just a marriage anymore. It was becoming a business rescue. I wanted to warn Ethan. But I needed proof. That was why I carried the wooden box that night. Inside was a small collection of documents, photographs, and an old letter from my father. The final document was the original ownership agreement for the land beneath one of Richard's largest developments. I planned to give it to Ethan after the rehearsal dinner. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I wanted him to understand what was happening before he signed anything connected to the Langleys. Then Richard called me the bottom rung. In front of 184 people. And something inside me finally stopped trying to protect everyone's feelings. I walked outside. Ethan followed. Dad? I kept walking. Dad, please. I turned. He was still wearing his gold family pin on his suit jacket. Then he slowly removed it. I don't want this, he said. I stared at him. What are you doing? I should have stopped him. You didn't know what he was going to say. I knew. That hurt more than Richard's insult. Ethan looked down. I've been scared. Of your future father-in-law? He nodded. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was Claire. He didn't answer. Instead, he asked, Dad, why did you walk away like that? I looked at the wooden box. Because if I stayed, I was going to say something I couldn't take back. He stared at me. What were you going to say? I took a breath. Nothing. Then my phone rang. It was my accountant. I answered. He spoke quietly. Daniel, We finished tracing the transfer. I stepped away from Ethan. What transfer? The one connected to the forged agreement. I felt cold. Who authorized it? There was a pause. Then he gave me a name. Claire. I looked at my son. His face changed when he saw mine. What is it? I couldn't answer immediately. Because suddenly, the woman he was supposed to marry in less than 24 hours was no longer just a bride-to-be. She was connected to the one thing I had been trying to protect him from. I told Ethan we needed to leave. He didn't argue. We drove to my house. In the kitchen, I opened the wooden box. I laid the documents across the table. Ethan read them one by one. The color disappeared from his face. Dad, I didn't want you involved. You knew their company was in trouble? I suspected. And Claire? I don't know how much she knew. He stared at the forged signature. Then he noticed something. The signature wasn't mine. It was his. Someone had copied his signature from an old financial document. Ethan sat down. She asked me to sign something last month. What? She said it was related to the wedding property. I looked at him. What did you sign? He covered his face with both hands. I don't remember. That was the moment we realized the problem was much bigger than Richard. The next morning, Ethan confronted Claire. I stayed outside. I didn't want to influence him. After 20 minutes, he came out alone. His eyes were red. She knew. What did she say? She said her father promised to save the company if we combined our finances after the wedding. I closed my eyes. And the forged documents? She said she didn't know about those. Do you believe her? He didn't answer. Then he said something I will never forget. I don't know if I love the woman I was going to marry, or the woman I wanted her to be. The wedding was cancelled that afternoon. Richard called me. He was furious. You've destroyed my family. I answered calmly. No, Richard. Your choices did that. You think you're better than me? No. Then why did you do this? Because you were about to make my son responsible for debts he didn't create. Silence. Then Richard said, You really think you won? I looked at the wooden box on my desk. I never wanted to win. The truth eventually came out. Claire had known about her father's financial problems. She hadn't forged anything herself, but she had helped pressure Ethan into signing documents he didn't fully understand. She convinced herself she was protecting her family. Richard had convinced himself that using Ethan's future was simply part of making sure his daughter had a secure marriage. Neither saw themselves as villains. That was what made it worse. Months later, Ethan moved into a small apartment. He stopped wearing expensive suits for a while. He started therapy. He also came back to work with me on a restoration project one Saturday. We spent 6 hours replacing rotten beams in an old house. At lunch, he looked at my hands. You know what, Dad? What? I used to think you were successful because you never needed much. I smiled. And now? He looked at the house around us. Now I think you understood something the rest of us forgot. What? That having money isn't the same as having a life. I didn't answer. We worked until sunset. A year later, Ethan married someone else. Her name was Nora. She wasn't impressed by my truck. She wasn't impressed by Ethan's salary either. At their small wedding, there were 42 guests. No country club. No speeches about social standing. No family pins. Before Ethan walked down the aisle, he came to me. He handed me a small wooden box. I laughed when I saw it. Inside was the gold family pin Richard had once expected him to wear. Ethan said, I don't want to forget what happened. I nodded. Then don't. But I don't want it to control me either. He closed the box. That, I said, is the right answer. Richard never apologized. Claire eventually moved away. The development company survived, but it was much smaller. I never celebrated that. There was no satisfaction in watching someone lose what they had spent their whole life building. My satisfaction came from something quieter. Years later, Ethan and I were sitting on my porch when he asked me about that night. "Dad, why didn't you say anything when he called you the bottom rung?" I thought about the 184 people staring at me. I remembered the laughter, the embarrassment, the humiliation. Then I remembered something else. My father's old workshop. The first house I built. My wife's hand in mine. Ethan learning to ride a bicycle. All the nights I worked while he slept. All the things that mattered and all the things that never needed a country club membership to become valuable. I told him. Because sometimes the strongest answer isn't the one you say. He smiled. And the phone call? I smiled back. That was just the beginning. He laughed. Then he became serious. Would you do it differently? I looked toward the sunset. Yes. He waited. I would have warned you sooner. He nodded. I wish you had. So do I. That was the truth. I didn't regret protecting my son. I regretted thinking I had to protect him from every painful truth. Because love doesn't always mean standing between someone and the consequences of their choices. Sometimes love means giving them the truth and trusting them to decide what to do with it. Richard called me the bottom rung because he thought my place in the world was determined by how much money I had. But that night taught me something I already knew and had somehow forgotten. A ladder only matters if you're trying to climb into a place you actually want to be. I had spent my life building my own ground. And when my son finally understood that, I knew I had given him something no family fortune could ever buy.